Lord God, we give you thanks for this day. We thank you for those among us who are mothers, and for all of us for the mothers we have had in our lives. We thank you for the time we have to gather. Please bless it and give us strength for serving you in all things. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, I want to try two things, and the first thing I want to try to do, Larry, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to see this, but I think you might be able to hear it if I do it right. So we're going to see about that. I'd like to try to share a brief video of the hymn that opens this chapter 5. It's a very short hymn, and it's an old American tune, and it's a very pretty tune. If I do this right, you'll hear it. If not, oh well. So let's see what happens. Yes. That's what I was looking for. Oops. Let's see. Try that again. Nope, that's not what I want to share. Sorry.
We could just sing it.
There we go. Can you see something that looks, those of you who can see, can you see something that looks like a YouTube page?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to try again.
And I can see the text.
Yes. There we go.
Thank you for sharing. That was beautiful.
Yeah, very touching.
Yeah, so that's actually the tune. It's in a hymn. It's not in our hymnal. I have found the text in another hymnal I own. I own several hymnals, and it's an early American tune and text as well. So from the 1700s, I think William Billings is the person who wrote the tune, and he is one of the first American composers of any sort of that we really know about. So I wanted to play it because it's actually a hard tune to sing, I think, a little bit, but it's beautiful. It's very haunting, and the words are very simple, aren't they? That it's not at all a complicated tune. Now, here's the interesting thing. It's very possible that that would not have been written for choir, but for a congregation. That a congregation would have done that kind of fuguing move where one person starts and then another group starts and another and so on, singing this simple tune. That wouldn't have been for choirs necessarily, but for a congregation. And several of Billings' pieces are that way, actually.
Was that the whole text? There's not another verse?
That's it. That's all she wrote.
Is it a shape note or no?
No, Billings is before shape notes. So if you don't know what shape notes are, in the middle of the 1800s in the U.S., especially in the South, but also in the Northeast and Midwest, some people wrote songbooks. Instead of using traditional notes, they used shapes of notes, squares and triangles and so on, to try to teach people who couldn't really read how to sing and read music. And several tunes that we like to sing in our hymnal are from the shape note time. The tune we sing from Amazing Grace was made popular by shape note singing. Amazing Grace. What Wondrous Love Is This is also from that era. A number of tunes were made popular doing that. And that's a different style of singing too. There, usually a men's part has the melody, a high men's part has the melody, and then everyone else sings around it their own parts. But it was like that. It was for average people, not just professional singers, to be able to sing complicated music together.
But Billings, you're right, was long before that. He was
Yeah, he was at least 2 or 3 generations before that. So, I was thinking when we were getting ready for this chapter, it was too bad we had put off our study until Easter. Well, about Easter for this, because this feels like we've gone back to Holy Week here. But then we read today's gospel reading, and that's still from before Easter too. So we're all a little confused right now. We're in Easter season, but here we are. We're still reading about life before, and that's okay. And where I thought I wanted to start really was revisiting Jesus's life for a minute, because I think this is, I wish I could take credit for this. I can't. This really is Edgardo's insight, but I think it's really important one. You know, there are 2 different ways of looking at Jesus's life and ministry after he goes public following his temptation. Last week, we looked at one of them, and that's to see it as a kind of joyous, exuberant proclamation of the gospel, of the kingdom of God, performing miracles and casting out demons and feeding the 5,000 and people getting excited and telling parables. And there's nothing wrong with portraying his ministry that way at all. It's exactly there in all 4 of the Gospels. But there's another side that we don't talk about as much, I think, which is just as true, which is that every single point in his life, there was resistance. There were people who said he shouldn't do what he's doing, and the people closest to him were often the ones who made things most difficult, and there was rejection. So I think it's a really important insight that Edgardo has for us to remember that it's not just like Jesus shows up on Palm Sunday and then, man, everything goes really badly for him for 6 days and he gets crucified. All throughout his ministry, there are signs that that's where this is going to go. That if he keeps doing what he's going to do, he's going to end up being completely rejected, and not just, you know, his parents calling his family calling him crazy, or you know, or or people in one town trying to run him out and maybe throw him off a cliff or something like that. I wondered what you all thought about that part of the chapter.
Well, it was a major eye-opening. I had never had that perspective before in terms of Jesus' public ministry. I was very much caught up in the great announcement and the miracles and everything he was doing in that way.
Yeah, I feel the same way before I'd kind of thought about this with Edgardo. Yeah.
A lot of the ones are sort of the ones where you're reminded where Jesus is taking us to task, like the part about he's saying you don't really want to talk, you don't really want to learn from me, you just want the free bread sort of thing. And also, I don't think it's mentioned in here, but where they say his mother and his brothers are waiting for him, and he's like, well, my mother and my brothers are the people who follow me and listen to what I do. So it's sort of like almost like we don't want to think about it because it's the parts where we are not as good disciples as we might be. But I was also surprised, even though I know I've learned this before at some point, about the part about the Pharisees being actually the closest version of Judaism to Jesus, and the fact that they're the ones we always think of as the bad guys in Sunday school because they're all the ones he's having, arguments with.
Yeah.
I've always considered the Pharisees actually to be between a rock and a hard place because they wanted to preserve the Jewish heritage and way of life, but at the same time they were living under Roman control, and they could see the Jewishness being diluted by all of the Roman influence, and so, like I say, they just couldn't do anything right, whichever way they did it.
We have a lot of misunderstandings about the Pharisees, who they were. It kind of gets passed down because everything in the Gospels, there's so much conflict between Jesus and them. It's like you said, Libby, a lot of times we assume that's because Jesus really didn't like the Pharisees. But often it's the people you're closest to, but different from, that you actually have the harshest dealings with. So, like, really, in the New Testament, it's the Sadducees who Jesus really wants nothing to do with. And they are of the sects in Judaism that we see. We really see the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, and they were kind of the power. They were closest to Rome. They were kind of the more powerful people. In institutional settings, so they probably had the high priests were probably Sadducees. You don't want to be a Sadducee because they're Sadducee, right? You don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not Pharisee, right? That kind of thing. Sorry, had to have it at some point, but Jesus really didn't want to have much to do with them, and he wasn't in Jerusalem, which is where they were because they were more powerful. But the Pharisees believed a lot of the things that Jesus believed, about the resurrection, about Moses, about the state of affairs at the time, and they just rubbed each other the wrong way because they were so close and yet still different from each other.
Mark,
Yeah,
Larry,
yeah.
it just appears like the disciples were really in training all along. They weren't supporting Jesus. They were letting him down. I hadn't realized that they were missing a lot of what was built into the words in the parables that I could understand that the masses would miss a lot of that in meaning, but not the disciples.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like they really didn't understand what was going on a lot of the time. As we said in the book, and I think it bears restating, I find this actually really helpful. I've never really felt like I was being crucified, metaphorically or let alone physically. But I certainly have had friends who have disappointed me and felt like I should have been closer with people than I am. And the kind of daily disappointments that Jesus deals with in his life, I feel are very relatable. And so to me, it says, hey, you know, you don't have to wait till things get so bad that you feel like, you know, you're about to be killed by someone in a crucifixion to feel like Jesus and you finally have something to relate to in terms of going through difficult times or sufferings. Jesus understands the kind of everyday disappointments that just about everyone faces. You know, even in the best of circumstances, we're all going to have some falling outs or disagreements, and people aren't going to understand what we're trying to say or do. Sometimes it's our fault, sometimes it's someone else's, but that's, you know, that happens as part of an ordinary life. And Jesus did live in that way, kind of an ordinary life, and can relate to that. So we don't have to wait till we feel like we're just down in the depths of our worst moments to call on Jesus to be compassionate with us and to care for us. We can accept that even ordinary things, he understands them and cares about the fact that we are enduring them.
So how did John and Charles, there's a comment here in the early part about that they didn't both agree on a particular perspective, but yet it's become a part of our Wesleyan heritage?
Yeah, so John and Charles were very good brothers who, like all good brothers, get on each other's nerves and do things and annoy each other. And we talk about them sometimes as if they were one person, but they were two very different people in some respects. And one of them was, in Charles's hymns, he tends to want to make more of Jesus's suffering and emphasize that more. And John is not always as comfortable with that emphasis. So we actually have examples where Charles writes hymns and John edits them and takes out some of the references to the suffering or to the bloody issue or this, that, or the other, kind of tones them down a little bit. So we know that John is not always pleased with Charles with specifics, but also if you compare Charles's hymns to John's sermons, John Wesley really does not talk about the specifics of Christ's suffering very often. He will say, he died for you, that kind of thing, but he doesn't go into a lot of detail. And he doesn't that's not the drum that he's beating in his sermons. But definitely, even in the hymns of Charles that could kind of get through John's pen and make it to the other side, you definitely see in them that is important to Charles. It's important to him, not just that Jesus suffered and died for us or on our behalf even, but how he suffered and how much he suffered and in what ways.
Yeah, and in that same context, you or Edgardo write that it's become a major component of the Wesleyan heritage, the suffering of Jesus. So are there faith traditions that do not dwell on that so much?
Well, yeah, definitely. I would say that, all right, so I'm going to give you a brief church history lesson, a 30-second church history lesson here, on top of the Wesley biography. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, Western Europe, so England, France, Germany, Spain, in the Middle Ages, the sufferings of Christ in Holy Week and on the cross were really emphasized very strongly. So crucifixes with Jesus being portrayed, and then them painted with very sometimes graphic detail. That was an important part of devotional life, not just sermons or whatever, but like personal devotional life, especially in like the 1300s and 1400s, right before the Reformation. And in the Reformation in the 1500s, some of that was rejected outright. So, for example, most Protestant crosses do not have Jesus on the cross. If you go to a Catholic church or an Orthodox church, it would be hard to find a cross that didn't have Jesus on it. If you go to a Protestant church, except for an Episcopal church, it would be hard to find one that did. So that's one example. I think then in the 100 years after the Reformation, the two major streams of Reformation. So Lutherans, we all know Lutherans, right? And then Presbyterians or Reformed. They kind of went through a period of what's called orthodoxy at the time, where they really emphasized their beliefs. And after that, there was a reaction within their ranks called pietism. And that was very strong among Lutherans, but not as much among the Reformed. And we get a lot of our hymns, even today, from the pietist tradition. In fact, many people think of Methodists as being from the pietist tradition in some way as well. So we have a little more in common with the Lutherans on this as well, and also Moravians to some extent. Whereas people who are from the Presbyterian tradition, the Reformed tradition, tend not to emphasize it quite as much.
They do not emphasize the suffering quite as much.
The sufferings as much, exactly. The particular sufferings as much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, anyhow, I just want to kind of wrap up that part by saying it's not that Jesus does not have joy, does not have feasting, does not do wonderful things at all. It's not like we're trying to rain on anyone's parade here, let alone Jesus's. But I think we need a nice full picture of what Jesus encountered. And when we say he emptied himself to take on a human form, we're saying he kind of went through a very ordinary, maybe not just ordinary, but a series of rejections, some of which seemed to us very ordinary and some of which weren't. His was a difficult life. You can imagine, can't you? Thinking that you had something that was so good for someone and giving it to them and then them saying, no, thank you, over and over again. That wears on you. No wonder he had to go and hide and pray so often. I'm sure none of us know what that's like. Sorry. Anyhow.
It's
not that level.
I'm trying to say it's still happening this very day, is it not?
Well, it is Mother's Day, right? I'm sure none of us has ever told a child something that was good for the child and had the child completely rejected out of hand. Dinner. Don't jump on that. Don't eat that. Stop doing that, right? It's a little like Jesus.
I had one more question before we leave this particular section. In the very near the end of the section, we talk about Herod.
Yes.
As being, the official indigenous rulers of Christ's people. Were you meaning in that statement that the Israelites? Because I had always understood that the Herods were not Israelites, that they were from Edom and were considered Edomites, and therefore sort of, at least in the Pharisees' eyes, somewhat illegitimate as a ruler.
Right. So I don't, that's not a, I don't have a lot of details to offer there. Certainly, the Herods wanted to be seen as the inheritors of the Maccabees tradition. So that the Maccabees were Jewish rulers from about 200 years before Jesus was born. If you know, the Hanukkah, the festival of Hanukkah comes from the time of the Maccabees, when they rebelled against Egyptian rulers and created their own kingdom. But that fell apart pretty quickly, and the Herodians were not, as far as I know at least, descended from the Maccabees, but they wanted people to think they were. And yes, I do think you're right that they were at least accused of being not really even Israelites, but they were close enough for the Romans and close enough for the Sadducees, or at least some of the Sadducees, to be kind of offered as tokens of people ruling you who you think should be ruling you. And that's kind of how the that was at least one of the ways the Romans operated throughout their empire, was to try to find, you know, people who they could use and who were willing to be used if it meant they got a, you know, a better slice of
Alice and
right, a little better slice of the pie, to not have to always rule directly through the governors. But the real power was definitely in the governors, because there's no way someone like Herod was ever going to do anything that a Roman governor didn't think was a good idea. That was not an option.
So was the point of Pilate sending Jesus over to Herod to make it look, to just show that it was like the Jews who wanted to kill him before he said, yes, okay, let's do it, because Herod wouldn't have had the power to do that?
Oh, I think Herod could have done it on his own. If one thing is true about Pontius Pilate, he never would have given a second thought to anyone killing anyone in his territory. Unscrupulous murderer who had no trouble putting as many people to death as possible. It wouldn't have bothered him one bit. What we see with Pilate doing things like that is a politician who knows how to play the game. And so his game is probably to pass the buck when he doesn't need to have it. And yeah, partly maybe to say, hey, this is really a Jewish thing, so let the Jewish people take care of it. That way I don't have to deal with another rebellion, kind of a thing. But, you know, if Jesus had somehow ended up at Herod first and Herod had just killed him, I don't think Pilate would have ever even known about it, honestly. Certainly he wouldn't have cared.
yeah, that always confused me, that passage where, and I can't remember, I think it's in a couple of the Synoptic Gospels, where the Jews say, you know, we don't have the power to kill somebody. And I mean, that's not really true, right?
But it was probably true of the temple representatives. At least, I don't think they really would have had the authority to execute someone. But it's not true of Herod.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and Herod also didn't really officially, I mean, his power was kind of more northern power also, Galilee, that area. So the power divisions were sometimes a little weird. Yeah, they also may have meant that they couldn't really do it because of the holy time of the year, with it being Passover. But certainly, yeah, it's not like the Romans really cared that much about who killed whom within this little backwater province most of the time. I don't think you would have still.
I mean, you know, it sounded like in certain scriptures, you know, stoning was a form of, you know, murder, execution that was common to the Israelites.
Yeah, that's true, and that's a good point. Like today, we read about Stephen, who was executed by a council through stoning. So, right, yeah. I mean, no one comes off from the crucifixion looking very good.
Yeah, sounds like everybody's playing a little power game.
Yeah. I mean, no one who's there really looks very good, and yeah, no one's telling the whole truth. No one's, everyone's trying to get someone else to do something so they don't have to do it. Yeah, that sounds about right, actually. Makes it feel very accurate historically. Yeah. So let's move on, because we're talking about Holy Week now, and I think for most of us, this is what we associate most normally with Jesus suffering. Again, I wish I could take credit for this, but I think this is really Edgardo who extends it to Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is triumphal in many ways, but also is tragic, because Jesus goes in and he really doesn't. No one really understands his entry at all, and he knows that's happening. And especially one of the insights from recent biblical scholarship has been that, among other things, Jesus was almost certainly trying to warn Israelites that our fellow Jews, that if they continued trying to rebel against Rome using physical violence, that they were going to get crushed. That was almost certainly part of Jesus's warning. He was warning them that if they kept going down, there had been several violent rebellions already by the time Jesus showed up, and he's warning them that if they keep pursuing violent rebellions, they're going to get crushed. And it happened. 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was sacked, and then 70 years later, Jerusalem was completely burned to the ground and was declared uninhabitable by Jews and was renamed and rebuilt as a completely Roman city because of Jewish rebellions against Rome. And it seems that Jesus was trying to offer, among other things, now this is not his only thing by any means, but certainly trying to offer a peaceful alternative, a way of peace, which is why he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and not on a war horse, for example. And so when when Jewish people don't understand that, it's not just that they're saying no to him, which is bad enough personally, but like for him, he almost certainly feels like that's leading them toward destruction, a really terrible, terrible destruction. So it's kind of like watching people who you're like, oh, don't go down to the beach. There's going to be a tsunami. We've got the tsunami warnings. The tsunami warnings are in there, like, it'll be fine. We like the beach. And they go down to the beach. You're like, come on. They're like, oh, what do you know about tsunamis anyhow? Like, you take it personally, right? Because, like, it's a tsunami. You know, they're saying no to you. But really, the tsunami's coming whether or not they listen to you. And sure enough, it comes and it wipes them out off the beach because they wouldn't listen. There's that weight of it, I think, for Jesus here. That they're heading down a path that's just going to end up very, very horribly for them. And so even like on Good Friday, when they choose a Barabbas when some of the people, we want to be careful here. It's not all Jews. We make that, we try to get to that in the book several times. But when the Jewish leaders in particular, and some of the Jewish people choose Barabbas over Jesus, they are choosing someone who pursued violent revolution against Rome, or against Pontius Pilate at least, over someone, Jesus, who's offering an alternative. Barabbas was not just a thief, he was almost certainly a rebel, someone who had been instigating violence or participating in violence against Rome. He might have been a thief too, but he was also a rebel. So that kind of thread of rejection goes from very clearly from Palm Sunday to the crucifixion. So what about you? What of the Holy Week stories or the celebration, celebration is not the quite word, the services we do in Holy Week, I wonder which of them is the one that you either find most meaningful or look forward to? You know, we have Palm Sunday, we have Maundy Thursday, we have Good Friday. Is any of those particularly meaningful to you, I wonder?
Good Friday to me is the hardest of all, knowing that Christ was crucified and those nails went through his hands and feet. I never could quite understand why they call that Good Friday. It should have been a horrible Friday for all Christians.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ruth Ann.
Yeah, Good Friday, for me, it's everybody deserts Jesus. You know, not only is he betrayed by one of his disciples, they all flee. Even Peter, the most stalwart, of course, you know, denies him 3 times. And, you know, it's just it's almost like the whole thing is lost. You know, all that he had worked for is now just gone to ashes.
Yeah.
I can't imagine being Jesus's mother at that time. The pain she was going through watching her son go through all this suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
For us.
And Good Friday goes through several different stages of rejection and suffering. You know, the vinegar and King of the Jews sign, and you know, all these various other harassments that I think that's often the most meaningful service, because we don't use music and darken the church. And, you know, we're down to the bare bones of life. We don't have anything glossing over reality.
So I'm hearing a lot about Good Friday. Is that the consensus among the group, or do we have other days that we also?
Well, I mean, when I was growing up, my parents we didn't really go to Holy Thursday or Good Friday services, especially. So the fact that you do Palm Sunday here, where we go through the Passion, I like that, because it felt weird. Even though, like, I would know what Holy Thursday and Good Friday were, it felt weird that we would have church on Palm Sunday, which was happy, and then church on Easter, which was happy, and there wasn't anything in between. So having that sort of built in the Palm Sunday, I think, is helpful. And then the other thing that sort of stands out is, like, I mean, we have separate services for Holy Thursday and Good Friday, but I think you say, like, it's one continuous service, and that's, I mean, Jesus didn't really have any break. Like, once he was arrested, it was completely being taken from one place to another, being tortured, being humiliated, just straight up through death. There was not even a, like, in a holding cell for a little while. Like, there was no break.
Yeah,
Can you imagine Jesus standing there and having people holler, crucify him, crucify him? How that would strike your heart.
Yeah. And that's a big difference between, like, Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and the rest of the week before, because we know from Sunday through Wednesday, he's kind of going and coming and going from the city. So he goes in for the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. He clears the temple, which is almost certainly what gets him crucified that week. Then he goes back out to Bethany and he stays there. And he does the same thing on Monday. He comes in, he teaches in the temple, and then he goes back out to Bethany Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday he comes into the city. And like you said, Libby, after that, that's it. There's no more rest. There's no more prayer or safe space for him anymore until he's dead.
Except a very close second for me is Maundy Thursday. And particularly in the Gospel of John, where he, takes off his outer garment, gets the basin and goes around and washes his disciples' feet, institutes the Last Supper, the Holy Communion. All that is very reassuring and comforting, even in the midst of the tragedy we know is about to befall.
Yeah, I would say for me personally, when I was growing up, really until I was really even into my 20s, probably Good Friday was the kind of most meaningful the services on Good Friday were the most meaningful to me. I think still personally they probably are, but since I've become a pastor, Maundy Thursday has become the service that I find the most connection with now, especially because I like to do the foot washing, and doing the foot washing as well as the communion on a Maundy Thursday just really, for me, puts me very close to how Jesus was living on that night, and I find that very moving and meaningful personally. But when I was a kid, my parents had this strange, and friends had this strange kind of tradition. We'd go to another friend's church for Good Friday because she was the music director there. My parents were good friends, and we really liked the music at that service and the way they did things. It was a Lutheran church. And then we'd all go out to the Silver Dollar Diner afterwards. And for dessert on Good Friday, which was weird, but it kind of felt like the right thing to do because like you're so emotionally spent, like all you want to do is kind of be with people who understand what you've kind of been through. It's kind of like a post, traumatic kind of event, kind of dealing with that.
Like after a funeral.
Right after a funeral or something. Exactly. Like you just want to be around people who know what you've been through and kind of, and not even talking about that. Like there were kids who were our ages. We'd talk with them. The grown-ups would talk. As we get older, we'd all kind of talk together. We did this until I was like 22. But the really funny thing was most of the people there were fasting. So like we'd be there for dessert, but then like none of the adults would be able to order anything except water. And so it was a very strange kind of way of dealing with it. But I do think it spoke to kind of how meaningful Good Friday was, that was our reaction, that we just kind of wanted to be together and kind of for as long as possible, kind of continue working through what we had gone through by commemorating the crucifixion.
As we've been talking, I kind of see that good Maundy Thursday more reflects the idea of Jesus' ministry that we were talking about earlier last week. He gives us the servanthood symbol of washing the feet. He gives us the Last Supper as a commemoration to have with us forever. All these comfort, symbolic things that would comfort us for, till now. And then Good Friday, we are commemorating this side of his, the agony side of his ministry.
Yeah.
I had never really thought about that.
Thank you. Yeah.
So when Jesus rides in on the colt or the donkey, you make a reference to Zechariah chapter 9:9, and it's almost exactly word for word like what happened. And it's obvious Jesus was very, very familiar with the Hebrew scriptures. And I often wondered sometimes, did he just do those things because he knew they were in the scriptures? And if he did it, that would, back him up a little bit in terms of what he was doing.
Yeah, I that's a that's a good question. I mean, one thing that's very different about the Bible than about us is that the Bible doesn't do a lot of psychology, and so we rarely get in either the Old Testament or the New Testament a lot about motivations for why people do things. I would probably say that answer, there's, that certainly for the divine nature of Jesus, it just simply is that those passages were about him, period, because he was the word that was spoken in the first place, as it even in the Old Testament. And for the human person, Jesus, yeah, I think it's at least possible what you're saying, that sometimes he thought, hey, this is a good idea because it will give me some credit, street cred. People will know, will see that I'm making a reference to something meaningful. So I don't think that's impossible at all. And there's nothing in the New Testament to tell us really one way or the other. Jesus does seem to know how to push buttons when he wants to with Old Testament passages. So there's no reason to assume that he's not pushing buttons on purpose. Certainly knows how to get people's attention by making Old Testament references left and right. That get under their skin.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we have.
Are you getting ready to move on to the next section?
I think we better, because we're getting near out of time, and I know.
I'd just like to make one quick comment in terms of the the driving out of the vendors.
Yeah.
It's an example to me of what I would call righteous anger. We're taught so much. Christians shouldn't be angry. Well, there is a place. It's not every place and not all the time, but there can be occasions, particularly when you are seeing injustice, it seems to me. That's when righteous anger can have its place.
Yeah, I think it's easy to justify our anger as righteous anger using Jesus as an example.
Right.
Just like one of my favorite things I've ever seen about Christians is, no, you're not being persecuted, you're just a jerk. Like sometimes we can do things and then use the gospel to justify our feelings afterwards, and we don't want to do that. But a certain kind of anger is definitely has a place. When something goes wrong, and you know it and you see it and no one seems to be doing anything about it, and it's in your mind at least unquestionably wrong, it's hard to see how you don't get angry about that. And that's why we have the Psalms also, which have a lot of angry verses in them for us to say. But yeah, I would agree with that. As we're wrapping up, I don't want to skip the fact that Jesus dies, or that that he's in the tomb. So we're going to get to that next week. But Gethsemane, really, I want to end at Gethsemane, because Gethsemane is definitely where the reality of the crucifixion really hits the ground. Up until Gethsemane, I know that Jesus knew that things were coming to a head soon. But I think even in the upper room, we're talking the human side of Jesus, of course, here, in terms of knowledge. His behavior is not the behavior completely of someone who thinks that it's going to happen tonight, necessarily. But once he gets to Gethsemane, that seems to change. Even before anyone else shows up, his prayer in Gethsemane is a heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, tearful prayer. He knows that something terrible is going to happen very personally, very soon to him at that point, without any doubt. Whatever he may have known before. And, you know, so for a lot of people who try to spend a lot of time thinking deeply and preparing to speak well about Christ's death, the two places they turn most are here in Gethsemane, when Jesus is praying, and then on the cross, when Jesus gives the cry of, what's sometimes called the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? We'll talk about that second one more next week. But here in Gethsemane, what we get really ultimately is this, not your will, not my will, but thine. That Jesus does not go to the cross unwillingly. He knows it's going to be terrible. He puts up the best reasons possible for God to do something else. Take this cup with me if you can, from me if you can, if you will. Not can, will. We've got to keep with that. And then he gives himself willingly to God's will for the situation. And that's important. We don't want to make it sound like at the end, God just kind of pushed him off the edge of a cliff and let go. But here he got to the edge of the cliff and he said, do I really have to jump? And the Father said, this is the way we're doing this, the only way to get to the other side. And Jesus says, then I'll jump. And that's kind of how it goes from there forward. I think it goes back to what you said, Ruth Ann and others, about Good Friday being so profound, is knowing that from that point forward, it's happening to him, but it's also happening because he said, let it happen this way. That's at least I think for any Christian, it's hard for that not to be moving and profound. So we will continue with that next week when we talk more about his crucifixion, and also questions about the atonement. That is, what is it we think this whole crucifixion even accomplishes? What's the other side Jesus is trying to get to in the first place, or God is trying to get us to in the first place? Lots of different answers to that, and some of them might surprise us who've always thought maybe there was only one answer we'd heard, and some of us might be interested to hear about some other answers people have had to that question over the centuries. I'm going to stop recording now. If I can